Well, welcome back to our Walk and Talk Part 2, looking at Israel and Iran and Gaza. And we're heading this series, Rising Lion, Risen Lion, to help us think as Christians about what is going on in the Middle East. And I want to suggest that there are two extremes that we can go to in our responses, two extremes that we tend to see, particularly on social media. The first one is this, that we can look at what is happening in the Middle East right now, and we can end up assuming that Israel are in the wrong, that Israel are the bad guys, and so whatever they do must be wrong. That they are the enemy. That they are the ones that are just trampling over human rights, that they're the ones that are persecuting others, that they are running an apartheid regime, that they are, as some of effectively said to put it, with all the concerns about this language, that they are basically acting like the Nazis, delivering their own Holocaust against others. The other response, and the one that I guess we tend to see, particularly on what might be described as the Christian right in the United States, is to see Israel as always in the right, that this is God's anointed nation, and therefore they can do no wrong. That the prophecies in the Old Testament are fulfilled in Jesus, and that the creation of this modern state of Israel is part of the fulfillment of end-time prophecies, and that therefore we shouldn't question, shouldn't challenge what Israel does. So what I want to do in this video is talk about that first one first of all, and then we'll come back to the second one. So we're going to deal with the temptation to see what Israel does as always putting them in the wrong, that Israel can do nothing right. And there's quite a lot that we could say about this. We could go back into history. And so there are some people, particularly those from other Middle Eastern countries, that would look and would say the modern state of Israel shouldn't even exist at all, that these are colonial invaders that have dispossessed other people of their rightful land. Now, I'm not going to go so much into the detail of that now. I've written about it elsewhere. What I would encourage you to do is go and look properly at the history of things. And what you will realise is that, first of all, there have been Jews present in the land for centuries. That even the term Palestine has that comes from not from an indigenous people, but from Roman occupation. It's the name that the Romans gave to the territory. So this is a land that has had Jews present there through the centuries, but has also been under constant occupation by powerful empires. The Babylonians, before that the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, and the Turkish Empire, and finally a British mandate in the land. And throughout history, what you've seen is that the Jews were persecuted, were scattered, became a diaspora, and then there was a move after the Second World War, after the Holocaust, to give them back a homeland, and it seemed right that their homeland should be the place where there were Jews still living, and had been the traditional homeland And so in the late 1940s, the United Nations put for proposals. You have the Balfour Agreement, things like that. And the proposal was that there should be a homeland for the Jews, a Jewish nation state. Alongside that,
Morning.
there was meant to be a Palestinian state for the Palestinian people. And what happened was that the first bit was realised in 1948, but the second bit wasn't. And primarily that's because other powerful nations around, Egypt, Jordan, Iraq, Syria, Iran, had no interest in either of those states existing. And so right from the beginning, there was an attempt by the Arab nations to wipe this fledgling small state off of the land. There was a desire for genocide. But also there was no interest in the Palestinian people. And so Gaza was occupied by Egypt and the West Bank by Jordan. And it was only in the 1960s when those countries went to war with Israel that Israel fought back and occupied those territories and some other bits as well. And we need to remember that history. It's helpful then to realise that when we hear about refugee camps in Gaza, we are talking about established towns and cities that have been there for, well, we're coming on for 80, 90 years, aren't we? So it would be helpful to think about why they are still designated as refugee camps. And that gives you some of the history. Now, in the surrounding areas, you have got terrorist organisations, Hezbollah in Lebanon and Hamas in Israel. Both of those organisations overtly anti-Semitic. Hezbollah long supported by Iran, Hamas in more recent years as well, with the specific stated aim of wiping out Israel, of creating an Islamic state. Remember that when people chant from the river to the sea, we shall be free, what they are saying is they want the removal of Israel as a land and the removal of the Israeli people. And so there's been this ongoing conflict with Hezbollah and with Hamas. And Hamas's strategy was to develop tunnels under Gaza, to use hospitals and schools as their headquarters, as the places where they fired rockets consistently into Israel from, and to use people from Gaza as a human shield. Since Hamas has had control of the government in Gaza, that means that they've had control of reporting and propaganda, so that when you hear from the Gazan Health Authority, that is Hamas, and you can find other videos online that will talk about how journalists have been threatened and had to censor reports, describing, for example, how Hamas operatives have dressed as civilians so that those figures are included and inflate the number of civilian casualties in conflict. And Israel, particularly after the horrors of October the 7th, 2023, have been fighting again an asymmetric war with a anti-Semitic terrorist organisation committed to their destruction and doing it in an urban context. Now, we might have all kinds of views about whether or not that's a good idea. Personally, I have big questions and concerns about it. We'll notice that for all sorts of reasons, that's nothing that Britain not the kind of thing that Britain attempted in responding to the IRA in Northern Ireland, although the contexts are slightly different. And it's easy for us to sit back here and to judge what the IDF do from relative safety. But what that has meant is that they have been trying to work out how do you take out an enemy that is embedded into civilian populations and may even disguise itself as civilians. And that's always been the problem. Now, whether or not they get things right or wrong, I think it is worth also remembering what they attempt to do. So within the IDF, again, you can go and check this out online. You can hear directly from people that have been in the IDF. There are official rules of engagement. That when you face an attacking mob and you have to defend yourself, you do not fire at vital organs. You try to preserve life. That when the IDF are about to launch an artillery bombardment, or when there's a planned missile strike, that things are done to warn the people that actually could jeopardize the operation. So the dropping of pamphlets and leaflets urging, warning people to leave an area is part of that attempt to preserve human life. As is something, and I think some of the images suggest that this has even happened in Iran, called rooftopping, where before destroying a building, the Israeli Air Force would launch a single missile that would take out the top floor of one of the higher buildings, giving warning again that a larger assault, a larger strike is coming in to give people a bit of time to get out. Israel's been attempting to do this in Iran as well. It's important that we're aware of that side of the story before making a judgment about Israel. Does that mean that the current conflict is right? Does that mean that Israel are not culpable, not responsible for significant loss of life? Does that mean that we shouldn't disagree with what they're doing? Well, no. Hello. But what it does mean is that we should be very cautious before we make judgments and declare that they are always in the wrong. And similarly, we can immediately presume, particularly from the way that things are talked about in the news, that Israel's offensive into Iran puts them in the wrong. That they've crossed red lines, to quote some, that they've broken international law. It's important to check when people make that announcement, is to say, well, which bit of international law have they broken? What are your qualifications to make that statement? Which treaties have been broken? Which conventions have they gone against? And I'm not going to get into all of the complexities of international law here. But what I would encourage you to do is, again, just reflect on the fact of the situation. Israel's strike against Iran didn't come from nowhere. These are two countries that have been in a form of conflict for years. There has never been a time when they could be described as truly at peace. Now, most of that conflict has been indirect. So Iran has carried out its attacks against Israel through its proxies, primarily Hezbollah, Hamas and the Houthi rebels in Yemen, that are all backed by Iran. And at the same time, the Iranians have been developing nuclear capabilities. There's been various attempts to put checks on that to ensure that they develop any nuclear capability just for civilian energy power purposes. But what we're aware of is that they have been enriching uranium far beyond what is necessary to generate electricity, and approaching the kind of weapons grade level of uranium enrichment. That's why it's important that we're talking about uranium being enriched over 60%, starting to approach a level where it could be used in military attacks. And alongside that, they've been developing, as we've seen the effects, ballistic missiles capable of hitting Tel Aviv and other Israeli cities. Now, other countries, including Israel themselves, have nuclear weapons on the basis that those weapons are used as a deterrent, as a last resort. The UK has nuclear weapons, but we've no intention of using them in anger as our own first response. That, in fact, our expectation is that they would only be used in response to another nuclear attack. And there are things in our thinking, in our underlying philosophy, Christian philosophy, but also secular philosophy, that hold us back from using those weapons of mass destruction. But remember that the Iranian commitment is to wipe Israel completely from the map. Remember too that the kind of the ideology behind it is that people should be willing to sacrifice their lives in this world for the potential of great enjoyment, the 70 virgins in paradise and that kind of thing. And that's why they've used suicide bombers. And that means that there's no kind of moral barricade holding back that regime from allowing Palestinians and Arabs in Israel and the surrounding area to become collateral damage. And that again is why those types of regimes and those types of terror organizations will happily use other human beings, citizens from their own country, civilians, as human shields. So from Israel's perspective, here's a regime that is already at war with them, and they are racing to get closer and closer to being able to launch nuclear strikes against Israel. That gives you the context for Israel deciding we're going to have to do something, we're going to have to take action ourselves, and we are going to have to neutralize this threat. I hope that gives us some context. Again, I'm not making a judgment here about whether those military strikes were the right thing to do at this time. Should they have waited until negotiations had completed between America and Iran? Was this even a safe way to go about things at all? Or should they have always sought to rely on mediated negotiations to encourage Iran to step back from the brink themselves? Those are all things to debate. But what I wanted to do in this video is to just encourage us to be aware of some of the surrounding information before we rush in to say that Israel is always in the wrong, that they are the ones to blame, to make sure we've got that full picture there. Thanks for listening in.